For the next 90 minutes, the three-party leaders will tackle the biggest issues of the campaign.
Yes, they're here in studio right now. Liberal leader Stephen Mcneil, Progressive Conservative leader Jamie Bailey, and the NDP's Gary Burrell.
And here's how it will all work. The three parties have agreed to a format that divides the debate into 5 sections, each with a different theme. We'll tackle health care, labor relations, education, and the economy.
There's also an opportunity for you to submit your questions during the debate. We'll put some of those questions to the leaders.
Try to come up with questions that haven't already been addressed or asked and on topics that we haven't discussed. You can submit those questions through the CBC Nova Scotia Facebook page.
The debate itself will begin and end with statements from each leader. The orders of those statements was decided by a draw.
We'll then put questions to the leaders. Again, the order of those initial questions was decided by a draw. But after that, there will be follow-up questions from us, and the leaders, of course, can debate each other directly.
And while the leaders know the general topics for the debate, they don't know what the questions will be. We also have an audience here tonight. Each party selected supporters to come to the studio, and the CBC also invited some guests. But they're just here to watch. They won't be participating. And one more important point, this 90-minute debate will be entirely commercial-free.
That's how it will unfold. We're going to get to all of it in a moment, but first, let's have a quick news update from Preston Mulligan.
Thanks, Tom and Amy. Well, it has been more than 2 years since Air Canada flight crashed at Stanfield International Airport, and today the Transportation Safety Board released its findings into what went wrong. On March the 20th of 2015, the flight was making its approach to Halifax in gusty winds and heavy snowfall when it hit some power lines and then slammed into the ground 200 meters short of the runway. More than 24 people were injured. The TSB says a combination of several factors led to the crash. It says the crew was flying on autopilot at the time. And Air Canada's policy did not require them to monitor the aircraft's altitude and distance once a flight path angle had been selected. But the strong winds pushed the trajectory back, and by the time the pilots saw the ground, realized they were too low and tried to abort, it was too late.
So one of the major findings from this investigation is that because the crews were not required by Air Canada policies to cross-check their altitude versus distance on this non-precision approach, that's why they didn't realize earlier that they were too low.
There were 133 passengers on board that night, many of whom have signed on to a class action lawsuit. One of them is Robert Cole, who says he now suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. Here's what he had to say about today's report.
I would assume, anybody would assume that they're checking those altitudes and distances constantly. How many other things are happening that you and I would assume are being checked on that aren't? We don't know, we're not pilots. So, no, I don't have any faith.
Since the crash, Air Canada has provided its pilots with more specific instructions for landing approaches and the limitations of autopilot, while the Halifax Airport has also reviewed its emergency response plan. Also, a trial date has been set for a man accused of killing his girlfriend in Halifax last year. Nicholas Butcher has a new lawyer and will be tried in April of next year. The 34-year-old was scheduled to go to trial last month for the killing of yoga instructor Kristen Johnston, but he fired his lawyer just before that trial was to begin. And now it's back to Tom Murphy and Amy Smith for tonight's Leaders Debate.
And thanks, Preston. Welcome back to Nova Scotia's election debate. Let's get right to it.
We begin with opening statements. The order was decided by a draw, and the first to speak is Progressive Conservative leader Jamie Bailey.
Good evening. Thank you, Amy and Tom, and Mr. Mcneil, Mr. Burrell, and thanks to all of you for inviting us into your living rooms tonight. Many of you have told me that this time you are looking for a real vision of a better future and a plan to get us there. Let me tell you about mine. I want a province where more of us are working here at home, where families can call their own doctor for help, where our roads, hospitals, and infrastructure are modern and in good shape. I want a Nova Scotia that stands proudly on the national stage as we all move forward together. To get there, we need to heal the wounds of the past few years, because the style of leadership we have does matter. Like many of you, I am tired of being told we are broke for 3 years, only to see record spending at election time. Like many of you, I am tired of governments that bounce from crisis to crisis, whether it's with our teachers, nurses, film workers, or even seniors in pharmacare. There is no vision in that. Our vision is based on one simple premise. More jobs and a growing economy means better health care and better schools. It means no more cuts to nursing home food budgets or mental health care, which offended me as much as I know they offended you. Our province is so much better than that. We can have a brighter future. It takes vision and a plan of action to get us there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We're going to hear now from Gary Burrell, leader of the New Democratic Party. Mr. Burrell.
Well, thank you, and good evening on the best evening of the year so far. And if I had to boil down what I would like to say to you this evening to one sentence, that sentence would be this, that in 2017, we in Nova Scotia need to make a major move in the direction of investment in people, in our health care, in our opportunities, our schools. We're not meant to be a province where 45,000 people are fed from food banks. And we're not meant to have young couples who can't see a future because their vision's clouded from graduation day by $100,000 in student debt. What we are meant to do is meet the challenges of this moment by making the bold investments that are required in improving access to doctors, nurse practitioners, and nurses, in community college free tuition, in unleashing a small army of educational specialists to support our kids in schools. My opponents will tell you that this is wishful thinking and rosy and unrealistic, and in this, in my judgment, they are inadequately informed. Throughout the world, governments are moving from a focus on producing surpluses for the budget to a focus on stimulating the economy and widening opportunity and investing in the future. It's the right road for us and the right moment for us to take it. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Burrell. And our final opening statement is Liberal leader Stephen Mcneil.
Thank you, Amy. When I was given the privilege to be your Premier, I asked all Nova Scotians to come together to help us put this province on a better path, and you did. Our province is stronger now than it was 4 years ago. Unemployment is at an 8-year low. Our youth unemployment rate dropped faster than any other province in Canada. Our fishery exports are soaring. Our agricultural exports are in demand around the world. We just had the best tourism season in our province's history, and our population is at an all-time high. We did all of that while balancing our books and restoring our fiscal health. We tabled back-to-back balanced budgets for the first time in nearly a decade. We were able to achieve these things because of the hard work of Nova Scotians, because of you. We know there's more work to do, but that's the exciting thing. We have a plan to continue to grow the economy by investing in infrastructure. We will twin highways, build hospitals and schools, and construct more affordable housing. We will increase funding for youth hiring programs and create more than 2,700 jobs for new grads. We will reduce taxes for 7 out of 10 Nova Scotians by raising the basic personal exemption. And our plan will support young families by introducing fully funded pre-primary for all 4-year-olds. This will save families up to $10,000 per year. We've had great success. Let's continue this journey together. Thank you.
And thank you all. Our first topic tonight is one that affects each and every one of us, health care. Wait times for medical procedures in this province are among the longest in the country. We can't keep up with the demand for doctors. 100,000 Nova Scotians don't have one. What would you say to someone who's watching tonight who doesn't have a family doctor? Mr. Burrell, we start with you on this one.
Of the dozens, maybe hundreds of public meetings that I've attended in my life on social issues, I was never any more moved than the meeting that was held 2 weeks ago in Sydney Mines on the doctor's crisis. And that meeting of hundreds of people that filled that high school auditorium had 7 physicians who spoke to the crisis and what in their analysis was needed. And between the 7 of them, they outlined the 3 things that have been missing in the Mcneil Liberal approach and the 3 things that need to be brought to bear now in the next upcoming period. First, focus on the problem. The doctors pointed out that from the time of the beginning of the Mcneil Liberal mandate, there was a great focus on forming a new centralized health bureaucracy in the province, and that this drew up so much of the oxygen and energy of the government that over on the side, patient care continued to deteriorate. Secondly, they said that there has to be listening and consultation, and more than one of the physicians said, we've got some of the answers. We know here what is needed in Cape Breton, but we've got to find somebody in Halifax who will listen. And thirdly, the physicians spoke about the need to bring adequate resources to the problem. So we understand the need to commit ourselves to it in the NDP. We understand the need to bring a listening ear and consultation, and we've committed to invest $120 million over 4 years to make greater access to doctors, nurse practitioners, and nurses.
All right, thank you, Mr. Burrell. Mr. Mcneil, you're up next.
Thank you very much, Amy. When we came to power in 2013, there were 9 different district health authorities. They were fractured across the province. There was a physician resource plan that was different in every community across the province. We realized very early on that every community was doing it differently. And one of the things that they were basing their physician resource plan on was age of physicians. We very quickly learned that that was not the case and when they were going to retire. There are many physicians in 50 to 60 years that decided to reduce their practice, find other ways to actually support their families or find a different lifestyle. What we've come to realize is that we need a collaborative care model that will deliver that health care to our citizens. We've announced that we'll do 70 collaborative care centers across the province that will bring doctors, nurse practitioners, family practice nurses together, a psychologist as part of that, mental health clinicians, to make sure that we're delivering and looking at the whole person as we deliver that health care. This phenomenon has continued on. We continue to make those investments. We're going to continue to work with our communities. One of the things that we brought forward in this most recent budget, we're increasing our residency seats at Dalhousie University from 36 to 56, 10 for other Canadian-trained doctors and 10 for foreign-trained doctors. That'll be, hopefully, our sons and daughters that have gone elsewhere to train, to study, and will come back and work in our communities. We've increased the specialist program by 15. And we've also said to doctors, you can practice in the communities that you want to practice in, whether it's in a collaborative care model, because we realize they want some diversity, and there are physicians out there who want to work in a sole practice.
Mr. Bailey, you're up next.
Thank you, Tom. When a senior like Reg Andrews has to confront his province's premier because he is so fearful and so worried that his wife cannot find a family doctor after 2 years, something has gone horribly wrong with healthcare in our province. And at its core, the problem is that we have a premier and a government that is not listening to the needs of Nova Scotians. I mean, how many times do we need Nova Scotians to gather in the hundreds at town halls in Sydney and in other places before they get the government's attention? You know, Reg Andrews and all of those people that have come forward, they heard Mr. Mcneil promise a family doctor for every Nova Scotian. And I know that it's pretty hard for them to hear the raft of promises that he just made now. Because at its core, when a government is willing to work with doctors and nurses instead of against them, when it's willing to listen to what Nova Scotians need, then we can make progress in our healthcare system. That's why our plan is so direct about urgently recruiting more doctors and nurse practitioners. And I do want to say a word about mental health, which has been a special project of ours for the last 2 years. We do need to make serious investments in our mental health system, both to help people heal and to get mental health in our schools so that our kids can practice preventive mental health and keep people out of crisis in the first place.
Now, Mr. Mcneil, Mr. Bailey brought up a point that during the last election you promised a family doctor for every Nova Scotian. That hasn't happened. Do you regret making that pledge?
No, I think everyone who is running to be the premier should be looking to have a family physician for every Nova Scotian. That's what every Nova Scotian deserves, to have primary care in the community they live in. As we've laid out very clearly, we believe the best way, and we're hearing from new health care providers that would be required in a collaborative care model where it's not just a family physician, that there would be a nurse practitioner, family practice nurse, dietitian in some cases. I believe in some communities, a social worker would be part of that team to look at the determinants of health and how we work with them. A mental health clinician, as we announced, would be part of every one of those 70 announcements that we brought forward. But anyone who's the Premier of this province should be looking and working with our healthcare providers. I met with Doctors Nova Scotia a number of times to look at how do we find a solution with that. They brought forward recommendations. We've worked with them. I've heard from nurses. I've heard from the doctors who Mr. Burrow was referring to in Gay Breton. I sat down with them to find solutions to the challenges. We know every community will be different. We've solved the problem in Digby. We're looking at other communities where we're seeing that people want to practice in. But it was an ongoing, but everyone who is wants to be the Premier of this province should be aspiring and working towards ensuring that every Nova Scotian has a family.
But Mr. Mcneil, that is not what you said. Maybe we missed the asterisk with the 2 pages of footnotes like you just shared with Nova Scotians on that promise. You promised them all a doctor. And the fact of the matter is the situation is a lot worse. There's 100,000 Nova Scotians without a doctor. You say you met with doctors. That was 2 weeks ago. You've had 3.5 years to work with doctors, but you didn't. You demonized them. You tried to make everyone think they were greedy. You cannot get ahead when you actually criticize publicly the very people we need to look after Nova Scotia.
The fact of the matter is, Jamie, I've met with doctors many times during my term as the Premier of the province. Did I meet them 2.5 weeks ago? Of course I did. I met them many times. I met them on the times on the 7th. I met them on the 7th floor at the time. I've also met with the Nurses Union. I've met with collaborative care teams across the province. We continue to work because it is fundamental that I believe Nova Scotians deserve to have access to primary health care. And I think all of us on this stage should be aspiring to that. No one should stand here and say that we're only going to make sure there's a family doctor or a family health care team for 90% of us or 95% of us. And I would take, as you look at what's happening, as challenging as it is in this province, we continue to make progress. One of the problems was when we came into power, there was no handle on when doctors were going to retire in Nova Scotia. We've now put in place a structure where we're looking at, and physicians need to come clear on when they believe they're going to retire. And what we're moving a transition from, by and large, sole practices which are across the province, where we need a team of healthcare providers to actually absorb those large practices that are there.
Mr. Burrow wants in on this.
Mr. Mcneil, I'd like to just step back to the driving question that came out of that important public rally in Sydney Mines and ask you squarely. In your opinion, is there or is there not a healthcare crisis in Nova Scotia?
Do I believe there's a crisis? No. I believe there are challenges in the healthcare system. Do I believe in certain parts of this province we require access to family physicians, specialists in some parts of this province? But I want to assure all Nova Scotians that if you require health care in this province, you can have access health care, whether it's primary care or emergency care in Nova Scotia. And you will be served by qualified, and you will be served by people who want to be there to work and help you. Are there challenges? Of course there are. And I believe we've laid out steps on how we deal with those issues.
We've all heard you make a lot of promises during the campaign, all three of you, many of them healthcare related. I'm wondering when, in your mind, you think it's okay to break an election promise? And maybe I'll begin with Mr. Burrow.
Well, I think that this is a core matter. The matter of integrity of political leadership. It's something that people speak about a lot. And I think that every government has strengths and weaknesses, but I would submit that this has been an area of weakness for Mr. Mcneil's government. I think that trust in public officials was diminished in Nova Scotia when the commitment to keep the film tax credit was not upheld. I think trust in public officials in Nova Scotia was diminished when following Mr. Mcneil's written commitment to public sector unions to respect free and fair collective bargaining. That was not upheld. And I also think that after 3.5 years of no money to produce endless millions just before an election, I think it has caused a problem, and I think it's a big problem. I think integrity and trust are core and key.
Okay, Mr. Bailey, when's it okay to break an election promise?
You know, I have an advantage over Mr. Burrow. I was here last time when Mr. Mcneil said it's never okay. Even though you made promises to the film industry, you made promises to every Nova Scotian about doctors, you made a lot of promises, and yet we know that they've all been broken. I'd say to you that leadership matters, the style of leadership matters. No one should say that with absolute certainty what's going to happen in the future. Yes. But we have to ask, were these promises sincerely attempted to be kept? And the answer of doctors, no, that situation has not gotten better. Mr. Mcneil refuses to admit that there's a crisis when so many Nova Scotians don't have a family doctor, and yet he won't even acknowledge that this problem is because of his broken promise.
Mr. Mcneil, is it okay to break an election promise?
Listen, in 2013, I promised Nova Scotians we would rein in power rates. Power rates have not escalated as they've done in the previous decade under both NDP and Conservative governments. We made a commitment to retain more young people per capita. We've done that here. We've continued to work to build on the economy. I've invested in classrooms every year as being the Premier of this province. I'm going to continue to make investments in young Nova Scotians. We've continued to work on ensuring that everyone has a family physician in this province. We have more work to do when it comes to making sure that that's the case. When the film tax credit came in, there was a subsidy of 50 to 65%. When I was asking Nova Scotians to help us get back to fiscal health, it made sense that that had to change. We now have a film fund that is 25% all in. We've had great growth in the industry. We've had one of the largest films that come towards our province. So to continue to make forward and work with Nova Scotians.
All right, well, moving on to ERs. Dr. John Ross has said we have too many ERs. The province's Auditor General says some see very few patients overnight. Are we wasting resources, and should we close ERs? What do you say, Mr. Burrell?
I think that Dr. John Ross made an enormous contribution to this ER question in his great report of 2010 when he said, when you examine ERs and ER problems, what you're really seeing is the canary in the coal mine of the whole healthcare system. I think that's the case at the moment. So we have such overcrowding in the ERs at the regional in Sydney and in Halifax and Dartmouth because people don't have anywhere else to get primary health care. At the same time, we know when people are discharged from those overcrowded ERs into the population of the hospitals. Often those hospital beds are full of people who in fact aren't hospital patients. They're waiting for a nursing home bed, but there hasn't been a single one of those opened in the 3.5 years of the Liberal mandate. And so people end up being treated in halls and in corridors and with a stretcher outside of the pop machine and so on. But the core problem the canary, that the coal mine picture here is lack of investment. Lack of investment in new nursing homes places, lack of investment in primary care.
All right, Mr. Bailey, do we have too many ERs? Would you close some of them?
Look, one of the saddest calls I've made in the last few months was to Kim Darcy, whose husband, Jack Webb, sat in a hallway in an ER for hour upon hour, worried that he would not survive the experience. Just this weekend in Cape Breton, 3 ERs were closed at the same time, leaving only the regional hospital open. And that hospital is not built to handle that kind of inflow at once. That's why people end up waiting for hours and hours or even days for emergency surgery. This all comes back to the lack of doctors. We need more doctors, we need them urgently, and we need them that trained with privileges to work the ERs. That's why this is a crisis. It's not just a family doctor crisis, it's an emergency care crisis, and Cape Breton is showing that, and Jack Webb's sad experience proves that we can't wait for a couple more years while Mr. Mcneil's plan gets the paperwork done. We need more doctors now, including emergency room doctors.
Mr. Mcneil, do you want in on that?
Listen, one of the issues, and I would agree with Gary, there's many people going across our province going to emergency room primary care, and I think it comes back to the very issue that we started this conversation about is access to primary health care. It's why we've seen, moving towards a collaborative care model is the one that will allow more healthcare providers to see patients in the right place. I think when you look at emergency rooms and some of the challenges we have, we need to have a uniform system of locum service where we can ensure that, and we know in weeks ahead when the emergency is going to be closed, that physicians around the province can have access to that timeline and commit to making that, or nurses can make a commitment to that. That's part of the whole solution on how we deal with this system. But let's not forget, 3.5 years ago, we had a very fractured system. Emergency rooms were closing across this province then. What we've seen now is a reduction in that. We've seen a reduction in emergency room closed. We're going to continue to work with those healthcare providers to make sure that we're providing access to primary care so that people aren't ending up down in emergency room. And the very thing, when you look at the QE2 redevelopment plan, when we talked about moving part of the outpatients out into where the people are instead of driving them down to the QE2, that's the principle behind that. People are accessing primary care outside of our tertiary care hospital.
Okay, we have to move on to labor relations now as our second topic. We all know that salaries are a huge part of any provincial budget, and there are a number of big contracts that are still outstanding, including the civil servants in this province. How do you strike that balance between fair wages and working conditions with spending what taxpayers can afford? And Mr. Bailey, we'll begin with you on this.
Well, first of all, start by working with the employees that work for the Premier to find those solutions. don't demonize them, don't work against them, don't tell the public that teachers are greedy and wrong or that nurses and doctors are greedy and wrong. Mr. Mcneil might have thought that was good negotiating, but actually it broke any trust that they had in him, meaning we can't get meaningful reform in our classrooms or in our hospitals because they don't trust their premier anymore. I happen to believe that Mr. Mcneil's actions, which were unconstitutional, which as of yesterday now the province is being sued by our teachers, are going to cost us a lot more money in legal costs and settlements in the end, in the millions, than if he had just done what every other premier has done in our province's history, which is to work it out with the employees that he has. That's what I propose to do. I don't happen to believe the single biggest problem Nova Scotia has in education, for example, is what % raise 1 or 2 the teachers get. There are real problems in our classroom. We should have started there. We would not have chaos in our classes today if we had gotten serious even about the things that don't cost a lot of money, like discipline and attendance and no fail. But none of that has happened, and it can't happen as long as we have this broken relationship with this premier. That's why I'm running for premier, because I think we need a new premier to get going on those important things.
Mr. Burrell, excuse me.
Council of Teachers
Excuse me,
working with
Mr.
the government
McNeil.
today.
As per the rules, we have to allow Mr. Burrell to have the next crack at this question. I'm wondering, how do you get contracts that taxpayers can afford but also provide fair wages and working conditions that the workers want?
Oh, this is a one-word answer: negotiate. And I want to say about the particular failure of the Mcneil Liberals on the teachers' question. I want to just speak to it for a moment as a parent. My wife and I raised our family in the rural area of the Musquodoboit Valley. This is not an area of privilege. And the children of our communities, they got volleyball, they got basketball, and they really got music. The music all of this came to them because of teachers who worked themselves around the clock and practically, literally, carried the communities on their shoulders. And so for the government to say to those people, you don't deserve to negotiate your own contract. You're going to work under a contract that we are now going to impose. This is, in my judgment, has been particularly hurtful and ill-considered.
All right, Mr. Mcneil, you wanted in on this?
Well, of course, we negotiated 3 contracts with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union executive, actually 2 different executives. They took it back to the membership. The membership said no. Each one of those contracts had a provision in it that allowed classroom teachers to come forward, make recommendations how we improve the classroom. We couldn't get a deal. It became impacting that. It was impacting the education of our children. We went forward, provided a solution. We also brought forward and asked classroom teachers to come in to help us. We have a council on classroom conditions. They brought 40 recommendations. We've endorsed every one of them. We've put money in our budget for those. We've also, I'm the first premier in this province to actually talk about the issue of inclusion. No other premier would talk about it. These 2 gentlemen wouldn't talk about it. I talked about it, and I said we need a council on inclusion to look at. We all believe in an inclusive school, but what does that look like when it comes to delivering in our classrooms across this province? I'm looking forward to the recommendation that will come in June, and the final one will come at the end of sometime in the middle of next year. But I think we also need to look at the amount of money we are investing in public education today. We have large central offices that need to be looked at, streamlined, making sure that those dollars end up back in classrooms in front of our kids. But to go back to your question about collective agreements, it has to be the capacity we can afford. Previous government prior to me gave a 7.5% pay raise and took $65 million out of classrooms. I, in all good conscience, couldn't do it. I said I will provide what I believe is a fair wage, which was negotiated at the bargaining table 3 different times. And at the same time, I put $65 million in the classroom and am continuing to invest in classrooms. Same thing if you look across all the entire public sector. We've continued to make investments. We've continued to invest not just in the last 30 days. We've invested in home care. We've invested in education. We ensured the infrastructure across our province is continuing to improve. Being premier, you need to strike a balance. You need to make sure that not only can you afford the wages you're prepared to talk about, but you need to make sure you have room to make the investments that Nova Scotians require in their communities.
Mr. McNeil, that would be a whole lot easier to take if you had applied that same rules to your own office. You talk about large offices. You gave $400,000 to your former boss, Danny Graham, while everyone else had to cut back. You've hired 6-figure people in your office.
I'll respond to that.
And you, sir, are the 3rd highest paid premier in Canada, even though we have one of the worst performing economies. So real leadership isn't just preaching to others Mr. Mcneil. It's applying it to yourself, and you haven't done that. That's why you can't work with teachers anymore, and you can't work with nurses and doctors anymore, and it's why our healthcare system is suffering, and people are wondering, when is the chaos going to end? You missed a chance to actually lead.
I can tell you, when classroom teachers are coming and working with our government, giving us 40 recommendations.
I see them protesting on the streets.
We're endorsing them. We put them in the classrooms. You talked about Engage Nova Scotia.
For all these negotiations that you had.
You've had your question. Let me provide you an answer. You said, you were the Ivany report. You talked about it. One of the only non-government agencies that was spoken about, and that was Engage Nova Scotia. It's not Danny Graham's Engage Nova Scotia, it's Engage Nova Scotia. To go out and talk to Nova Scotians, to engage them. What they talked about was making sure that we built capacity in community. We worked with them, and I want to go back to the very thing when we came into government. We were in a worst performing economy. We were at $500 million in debt. Today, we have balanced budgets. We're investing in the things like education that the former government were cutting from. We're continuing to make investments in the things that matter to Nova Scotians.
I'd like to go back to your contention, Mr. Mcneil, about all the negotiating that you did with the teachers. We had multiple demonstrations at Province House of Teachers. We had on one occasion a larger demonstration than I've ever seen in my lifetime, which has been somewhat longer than either of yours. Of those thousands,
I don't know, Gary, I'm aging every day.
Well, I know the feeling, brother.
Together.
But if you went out on those demonstrations, you would see every second person amongst the thousands of them had a button on that said, negotiate, don't dictate. Though I think that if you spoke to the majority of teachers, they wouldn't say they had been negotiated with. What they feel has happened is something more like this, that teachers together have had a sense of had their back being against the wall, of seeing their colleagues dropping with stress leave, going out on long-term disability, burnout, and they turned to the government and said, help, we're drowning. And what happened was, essentially with Bill 75, the government said to them, you shut up and get to work. I don't think that's a negotiation.
All right, Mr. Burrell, I wanted to ask you, the teachers in the province reached 3 tentative agreements, rejected by the membership, all of them. How long would you have let negotiations go on, and at what cost?
Negotiations held under the cloud of Bill 148, which said to those negotiators, you either agree with a 2-year wage freeze or we're going to impose a contract, are not negotiations in any normal sense of the word, and I do expect that the court is going to find this to be the case as well.
Mr. Mcneil, in May of 2013, you tweeted, we support the collective bargaining process and the right to strike and will continue to do so. But you legislated a contract for teachers. Haven't you gone back on that word?
Not at all. But first of all, let me correct something that Mr. Burrell said. He talked about 148. It didn't apply to teachers because they had the right to strike. They just didn't take that exercise. What they did was they actually continued to draw services where it impacted classrooms. It became a point where we were negotiating with their executive, the very executive that teachers voted on and brought towards us to make negotiations. I've heard from teachers across the province. Were they mad at the government? Of course they were. They're also mad at their own executive. They felt no one was listening to them. They felt they weren't being heard. We continue to engage. In this process, when you're negotiating, I can't go to the employee because they need to deal with the negotiating team, which is the executive. And they obviously weren't representing the teachers. After we had a contract, teachers came in and began to work with us. We now have 40 recommendations how to change the classrooms, the very thing that Mr. Burrell is talking about. I heard last election, teachers are feeling the pressure from the $65 million cut before we came into power. It's why we continue to invest in classrooms. I will say, we obviously have missed the mark in some cases. When it came to investing in those classrooms, we listened to what the teachers union brought forward, which is capping class sizes, looking at curriculum outcomes. But we've heard loud and clear from teachers. We've followed through on those recommendations and will continue to do so.
Mr. Mcneil, the collective bargaining process with the teachers ended, was over because you decided you weren't going to go back to the table a 4th time. Have you, with all these other contracts that are outstanding, have you become almost a liability out there when it comes to sitting down at a negotiating table as the province to negotiate with these other unions?
No, I think one of the things that Nova Scotians understand is that I represent all taxpayers. I don't just represent those that are sitting on the other side of the table. That's the executive of whatever union we're negotiating with. I have the mandate to represent the entire province. My job is to make sure that I can, when I make wage settlements, they're ones that we can afford as a province. Same time, make the investments that Nova Scotians are telling me they want me to do. Twinning highways, building infrastructure, dealing with the issues around our hospitals, making sure that we can make investments in classrooms, making sure vulnerable citizens in our communities get looked after. All of those are the mandate of the government. When I'm negotiating, my job is to look after all taxpayers, including those that are sitting across from the table. That's why we've provided what we believe was a fair offer that was accepted, I will mind you, 3 times by the Teachers Executive, 1 time by the NSGEU, and each time we went back to the table with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, we moved every time. Our offer was different every time, and they accepted it, and that's where we ended up.
Mr. Burrell wanted to jump in.
I would just like to, coming back to the teachers' non-negotiations, Mr. Mcneil, I would like, on behalf of those thousands of people who protested at Province House, just to ask you plainly, do you still stand by your decision to lock the students of the province out of the schools of the province in December?
Gary, yes. What happened was on Friday night, I received 8 letters from 8 different superintendents that told me they could not secure the safety of kids on Monday morning. I reached out, our government reached out to the Nova Scotia Teachers Union executive and said, can you guarantee us the safety of those kids? They would not. We came back in on Monday morning. We had one choice. I ask any Nova Scotian, if you were being told that you could not guarantee the safety of the children that were entrusted into you, what would you do? Would you let them go into harm's way, or would you do? I reached out to the people, to the union who was representing the teachers of the classrooms. They would not agree to that. Finally, on Monday, they agreed to that. We then went back to the process of going back to the table.
Okay, Mr. Bailey.
Let's just look at what really happened here. There were negotiations going on, and Mr. Mcneil got frustrated, and he thought he would be tough, and he would legislate the teachers back to work. But you know what? Being tough doesn't mean imposing your will on someone just because you have the power to do it. That's not leadership. That is a failure of leadership. So what if they had talked 3 times already? You keep going till you get the job done. Just because you have the power of the Premier to bring the hammer down on teachers, on nurses, on a lot of people, and everyone's wondering after this election, if you are re-elected, who is going to be next? That is not how you build a province. You've broken your relationship with the very people we need to look after our kids in school, to look after us when we go to the hospital. That's the real issue. That's the cost of when you think you're being tough, but really you're just imposing your will because you can.
If I could respond to that, the fact of the matter is I worked with the NSGU just to bring in PTSD legislation. I've worked with the Nova Scotia Nurses Union to make sure that we look at emergency room safety. I've worked with teachers across the province to ensure we work on classrooms. But I'm going to tell you, when it comes to negotiating wage and wage packages, they become difficult conversations.
Okay, well,
my job is to make sure I represent all taxpayers, not just those sitting across the table from us. And sometimes those are difficult conversations. Do you think I enjoy them? No, but I ask for the responsibility to make sure that this province lived within its means. At the same time, we can make the investments that make a difference in your lives and in your families' lives.
Now, Mr. Mcneil, just yesterday, you mentioned the NSGEU. They announced they were filing for arbitration because bargaining is at an impasse. You've passed but not proclaimed Bill 148, which gives the government the right to impose a wage package and avoid arbitration. Are you going to invoke it?
We're going to look at our options. The NSGU has made their recommendations yesterday. We'll look at what are the options that are available to us as a government. As I have said many times, they've asked for an arbitrator. We're a long ways away from that. It's one that we all have to agree on, both sides have to agree on. That conversation will take place, and then we'll make a decision.
Well, that's a cop-out. I mean, we're in the middle of an election campaign, and they deserve to know what your plan is. We're going to repeal Bill 148 because it's unconstitutional. It's going to cost millions in legal fees that we could otherwise use to actually make care better. Mr. Mcneil, you have a chance now to say what you'll do if you're rehired, not hire me again and then we'll see. That's why everyone worries about how much more chaos will occur in our healthcare system or education system if you continue down this track where when you get frustrated, you use the power of the Premier to impose your will instead of working it out with the very people that we need to make our services better.
Jump in?
Well, I think that earlier Mr. Bailey used the precisely right word here when he described when he described the negotiating atmosphere under Mr. Mcneil's government as one of failure. I think all governments have areas of success and areas of failure, but when you look under this file, labor relations, and see that Mr. Mcneil's government has failed to successfully negotiate a single major union contract in the public sector, I think it can only be described as a failure, and I attribute this failure to an attitude of dictation, not negotiation, an attitude of proceeding in a kind of a my way or the highway way, and it has led us to an impasse on a number of fronts, none any worse than the teachers.
All right, well, we are moving on to our next topic of education. And when it comes to annual test results, there are often big disparities between certain pockets of the province. Just wondering, how can you ensure students, say, in Yarmouth are as well prepared as students are in Halifax? And Mr. Mcneil, you're up next with that.
Well, thank you. One of the recommendations that came from the council with teachers was that we would, first of all, cap class sizes from P to 12. We'd already done it from P to 6. We'll do it through junior and senior high. We've committed to making that happen. But there was also what was a fund that would be for the very thing you refer to, where there are pockets in our communities or in our province where literacy and numeracy skills are low. We would send in a team, we would dispatch funding that would allow them to hire experts to come in. We continue across the province to make sure that we invest in literacy and numeracy supports. We're very concerned what we heard coming out of school boards more recently about the fact they were making cuts to literacy programs in certain parts of the province when we had actually funded them and given them the funding. That's why we've said we're going to go in and have a look at what's happening in those school boards to make sure that those investments are actually ending up in front of the classrooms and making sure the kids are receiving that. But one of the biggest things that came out of the council was, in my view, was that recommendation that said, let's assess where we have areas where there may be a challenge, and then we'll send in a team of people to make sure that we continue to bring up those skills.
Mr. Bailey, you're up next.
Well, first of all, let's take the politics out of schools altogether. These are our kids. People are very angry that schools in real need, like in Eastern Shore or in Spring Hill in my riding, were skipped over on the priority list so that new schools could go into the Premier's riding and the Minister of Education's riding. That is not right. Politics should go all the way from there.
It's not accurate either.
Secondly, let's actually do the reforms in our classrooms that don't cost a lot of money, like get rid of that no-fail policy. That's not fair. That just delays problems. It's actually harmful to our kids. Let's give teachers the real discipline and attendance policies they deserve. And as Premier, I would tell them I will have their back when they make those difficult decisions on behalf of our kids. And I want to add a third one because it's so important, and that is let's get mental health into every school in this province so that kids and their teachers know what to do at the early signs of mental illness. We can take kids who otherwise are going to get ill and put them back on the track to proper healing.
All right, let's hear from Mr. Burrell.
I think that one of the things that teachers said during the many protests associated with the long negotiations was that this is not the central crisis in our school system. The central crisis in our school system is the unworkability of the classroom. And the unworkability of the classroom needs to be addressed in two primary ways. And we in the NDP are committed in our platform to address both. One is the introduction of class size caps on the model in which our neighbours have them in New Brunswick. And the second is to unleash a serious army of specialists and educational assistants and speech pathologists and guidance counselors and school counselors and all these other support workers needed so that teachers can get back into the situation where they feel that they're able to give, as they haven't been for some time, real expression to their vocation.
Mr. Bailey, I want to ask you about post-secondary education. You're vowing to get university tuition in this province down to the national average by signing a memorandum of understanding with the universities. Some people hear that and they say, if it was that simple, why wasn't it done before?
Well, it has been done before. I happen to have worked with a premier that did that when I worked as Chief of Staff to Premier Ham. He did exactly that. He entered into a long-term multi-year funding with our universities in exchange for an agreement to get our tuition down to the national average. And at the very end of his term, that was achieved. This is a long-term goal. That cannot be done overnight. I acknowledge that. But I think people are looking for plans that aren't just for 1 year or just for an election year. They want to see plans that are unfolding over a series of years in a practical way. I think we have to get back to that. You know, we train a lot of young people in this province, and we have universities that are very good at what they do. And I'd like them to be focused more on research and more on commercialized production so we can create jobs here at home. And I am prepared to stand with them to do that. But in exchange, we do need to make sure that the tuitions are fair. Otherwise, we literally push our graduates out to other provinces where they get jobs quicker at higher pay so they can pay off their debts. That's why I think that goal is so important.
Mr. Burrell?
Well, I'm glad that you've turned to post-secondary education, because this is a sharp situation. We have in Nova Scotia the fastest rising tuition in the country, and our young people on graduation face the highest level of indebtedness anywhere in Canada. At the same time, we see that our neighboring provinces have made major investments to make post-secondary education more affordable. We cannot get where we need to go while we have average indebtedness of university graduates at the level of $40,000. This requires a serious intervention. The first intervention that we are prepared to make in the NDP, if we form the government, is to make all community college tuition in Nova Scotia free, and to invoke a 10% reduction in university tuition over the next 4 years.
Now, Mr. Burrell, that comes with a big price tag. Just wondering, what guarantee is there that these students don't leave after graduation? You invest that money and then they go to other places for work.
We know that presently the enrollment of the Nova Scotia Community College is 90-some% in Nova Scotia students, and that the number of graduates of the Nova Scotia Community College who remain in Nova Scotia is 90-some%. This is the perfect place to make a significant investment to open up doors to opportunity to a generation who, in my judgment, have largely had them shut.
Mr. Mcneil, what do you think of that?
First of all, if you might, I'd like to correct the record. Mr. Bailey talked about a school being built in my riding. That was actually approved by the NDP government back when they were in power. And we continued to come through when they went to combine two schools, and the same thing in the ministers in the riding back in 2008. But to your point about post-secondary education, I think it's critical that we continue to make sure that not only university but community college is affordable. That's why we put in a plan. If you're a Nova Scotia student and you complete your 4-year degree in 5 years, we will forgive the entire portion of your student debt to Nova Scotia. At the same time, we're working with employers to ensure that we're providing job opportunities here. 2,700 jobs for university graduates, 1,500 jobs for apprentices. One of the things that was startling to me, we came to power, was that 50% of our apprentices never actually finished their schooling. We changed that to work with employers to make sure that happens. If the education is free and no job, we've paid for an education and sent them to build an economy somewhere else. Let's strike a balance. Let's ensure that that education is affordable. At the same time, we're working with the private sector entities to provide job opportunities here in Nova Scotia. Very proud of the fact that we've lowered youth unemployment. We provided more job opportunities on a per capita basis than any other Canadian province for young people, and we have more work to do.
Mr. Bailey,
I just want to say something surprised. I actually agree with Mr. Mcneil that making education free means we're going to end up training people to go and work somewhere else. The part I have trouble with, though, is Mr. Mcneil is the Premier that allowed our tuition to skyrocket by 21% during his term. He actually created the very problem he's now trying to solve in the middle of an election campaign. Well, that's not good enough. We have to get away from that 3 years of making things worse and then 1 year that everything will be fine if you just trust me again kind of mentality. That's why we do need a long-term plan to bring tuition down to the national average. And you know, I want to talk about apprentices because it's a very, very important point. Apprenticeships and journeymen and the trades, they're so important. That's why I want to put them back in our schools. But that only works if there's jobs there for them when they graduate. So you can't talk about apprentices without actually also talking about jobs and how we kickstart our economy and get it growing so that they can stay and work here.
Mr. Burrell, what do you think? When it comes to the actual classroom, what do you think it would look like under an NDP government? I'm thinking in terms of the number of students, working conditions for teachers, and the issue that the Premier raised earlier, which is inclusion.
Well, I think the first thing that would be improved under an NDP government would be teacher morale, which is at an all-time low. For several months through the negotiations, Mr. Mcneil and his Minister of Education, at every opportunity when they were asked by the media about the teachers, spoke in a way that was denigrating and demeaning of members of the profession, and this has caused a great deal of hurt. We have committed ourselves to rescind, revoke, remove, every other word you can think of, Bill 75 and Bill 148, and to reopen negotiations. That's the first thing that I think will improve the situation. And the second is to have class size that the teachers union have said they have to have in order to be able to do their work. And the third is we have to have the specialists that are needed. We understand that it's very expensive. Nobody questions that. But where better could we invest our resources in Nova Scotia? I think we need to understand that the education of a generation of our children is a higher priority than generating a budget surplus for the provincial government.
All right, do you want to weigh in on that?
I'm glad to hear you say that, Mr. Burrow, because you voted for every one of the Dexter government budgets that cut education by $65 million. Now you want to invest. That's great. The question was about inclusion. It's a very important topic. We're all here to deal with these issues. You know, I think you got to set goals when you talk about tuition. We do want every child in this province to soar as high as they can through our education system and off into a better life. I don't want to leave anyone behind. That's why we want to put mental health in our schools. That's why we want to put the trades in our schools. That's why we're prepared to make the changes the teachers were asking for outside of their pay, because that's how we actually build a richer province. But it takes a premier that our educators trust, and with the cuts the NDP made and the mess that Mr. Mcneil made of his relationship with them, that's why I'm running for premier. We actually can kickstart these important changes with a change in government.
Mr. Mcneil, what's the classroom in Nova Scotia going to look like if you're re-elected?
First of all, let me surprise you. I'm going to agree with Mr. Bailey. We agree. That's why we're moving and putting trades in schools today. We announced 7 leading into this budget. I'm very proud of the work we've done with the apprenticeship agency. We agree. They need to have jobs in Nova Scotia. We've seen a surge that apprentices are getting their jobs and their hours in Nova Scotia. That's a great thing. I'm very proud of the fact that we've introduced in this coming, with our budget, fully paid pre-primary across the province to ensure that every 4-year-old is getting a play-based, evidence-based program that will allow them to enter the school system at an equal level as their counterparts across the province. No matter what socioeconomic circumstances you're born into, it will be available to every child. That will give them the start that will require it. As we continue to make the changes that are taking place in classrooms, like capping class sizes, we started at P to 6, which was endorsed by the Council and Classroom Teachers, who said they were the right size. Going now and taking their recommendation to do it from 7 to 12 and continue to improve the outcomes for our students.
All right, well, let's talk about rural schools for a second. Mr. Bailey, do you commit to keeping rural schools open, all of them, and at what cost?
You know, it's got to be frustrating for parents in rural schools to watch their schools close, as they have over the last number of years, to watch the hope of a better community go out the door, and then in the middle of an election campaign, suddenly hear Mr. Burrell and Mr. Mcneil say we're going to put a moratorium on that. That is an easy promise to make, but I'm not prepared to do that. I do think we have to completely change the way these decisions get made. We have to completely change the formula for how we fund all of our schools, particularly our rural ones. And that starts with recognizing that they have an economic value to small communities as well as an educational value. They represent hope that those communities can attract new young families to the area. Because ultimately, school closures are really a symptom of a greater problem, which is there's no jobs. There is little hope. People are giving up. That's why we need a real vision about growing the economy so those schools and those communities have hope again. So what am I telling you? I want to work on the big things so that those schools have hope, but I am not going to stoop to a middle of an election moratorium promise, which Nova Scotians, quite frankly, are tired of hearing.
Mr. Burrell, I mean, half-empty schools, is it wise to keep them open?
I would say, first, just to defend my own record, that I've been involved in the movement against the closure of small rural schools for over a decade. This isn't an idea that has just come up in the last number of weeks. There's one principle here. If we do not have thriving small rural schools, we will not have thriving rural communities in Nova Scotia. So the question of the viability of schools has been worked with under a system which allowed travesties like the closure of the River John School to take place. What we're saying is, plainly, this system isn't working. We need to have a new system in which the government doesn't sit back as a spectator and evaluate whether or not a hub school proposal is something that they think up or down about, and in fact, in all cases till now, down, but rather a system where the government will become a partner with communities to work and take responsibility with communities to develop a hub school proposal. So until we get those guidelines, we need a moratorium on the closing of small rural schools.
All right, Mr. Mcneil.
So first of all, we did not call for a moratorium on schools. What we said has happened. Those schools that have been announced to be closed, they will continue through that process. What we have, and with the community of Lewisburg, we've come up with a community school because there was an employer in the area who brought forward a proposal that would work with the school board as well as Breton University and the University of New Brunswick to continue to bring during research in the fisheries. It's a positive solution for that community. It works. What we did say, though, during the campaign, when you look at the commitments that we've made about capping class sizes from P to 12, bringing in pre-primary that we want to see in schools, we think the school boards need to have the entire information on what their physical footprint would look like. What does it mean to their schools if we cap classes from 7 to 12? That'll change from the information they have now. We're saying you need to pause until you get all of the information. And what does the classroom look like in terms of size? Do these two gentlemen agree with the council when they said we want to cap class sizes? If they do, that will require a bigger footprint. And the pre-primary one that we want in schools across the province will also change that footprint. All we've said to them, if you're in the process, let's pause this until you get all of the information.
Okay, we want to move on to our next topic, and that is the economy. As we know, young people are going elsewhere for work. What is your plan to keep Nova Scotians at home when wages elsewhere are often such a big draw? Mr. Burrell, we'll begin with you.
Well, there are a number of things that are required, but I think we should probably start with the facts. Principal fact is that youth employment fell more in last year in Nova Scotia than in any other province in the country. So this is a matter that calls for capital I, capital P investment in our people. And we see this as having a number of components. One component is that when you make the investments in healthcare we're talking about, the investments in education we're talking about, the investments in childcare we're talking about, you're hiring early child educators, teachers, educational assistants, LPNs. When you build more nursing home beds, you're hiring lots of CCAs and nurses. In other words, you are creating a mega stimulus to the economy for people who work and spend their incomes here in Nova Scotia, and this is the path of the moment towards economic growth. Secondly, if we form the government, we are going to implement over 3 years a $15 minimum wage, so that we'll be in a position in Nova Scotia where everyone who has a job will actually have some money that they can spend from time to time, which is not the case at present. We also will restore the film tax credit. After the freight train that was driven through the film and television industry 2 years ago, we understand that it's going to take a long time to rebuild to the place where we were, but what Bette McDonald calls this beautiful industry is so perfectly suited to Nova Scotia and has so many people employed in it. And we would also reopen the department that the Mcneil Liberals closed, the Department of Rural and Economic Development, because we understand that there are areas of Nova Scotia that are economically vulnerable and need that extra focus and support.
Mr. Mcneil, how do you keep young people in this province working?
Well, we led the country last year on a per capita basis retaining young people. As Gary pointed, youth unemployment is dropping in Nova Scotia, bigger drop than any other province in Canada. We continue to work with private sector employers to ensure that a university community college grad gets their first job in Nova Scotia. That's why we put in youth hiring programs that made sure that when a business is looking to expand, we would help them with that first and second year employment. That's why we broadened the apprenticeship opportunities for young people to find that first job here in Nova Scotia. That's why we've announced that we would do a 7-year, $55 million build of highway infrastructure across the province that would see twinning in our 3 major arteries, as well as the Sackville-Bedford-Burnside connector that will be a 4-lane highway. We have in our budget a $50 million community spend, predominantly around schools in our communities. We know there are communities that require those investments. We get into work with those. They will put young people back to work, but it's important to recognize that it'll be the private sector that will drive those job opportunities. We need to continue to partner with the private sector to make sure that when we are working with these hiring programs, that they're lasting and staying. And that's one of the positive things that have come out of the decisions that we made over the last number of years. We're not only seeing young people get jobs for a short period of time, they're actually getting full-time jobs working here in Nova Scotia.
All right, Mr. Bailey, let's hear from you.
Fact is, over the last 3 years, Nova Scotia has had the slowest growing economy in our country. Our workforce has shrunk by over 10,000 people. 60% of them are young people. It's hard to imagine in the wake of that economic hardship that we would have a premier in government that would cut the legs out from under one of the thriving industries that we did have, which was the film industry. That industry had 3,000 people working in it when Mr. Mcneil started. It now has less than half that, and I think all of us as Nova Scotians feel the sting of watching a great movie like Maudie playing to rave reviews around the world, with Newfoundland getting all the jobs and all the benefits. So the first thing we can do is fix that. But really the last thing we need is a flurry of pre-election promises like we've just heard from Mr. Mcneil. This time we need vision. We need a long-term plan. We need to know where we're going, not just in an election year, but for the next 10 years. To me, that means putting thousands of Nova Scotians back to work, rebuilding the infrastructure of this province, the highways, the secondary roads and rural roads, the hospital, rural internet. We have a plan to do that. And it's matched up with training Nova Scotians by putting vocational training back in our schools. Let me give you an example. We're all frustrated at what's going on at the Irving shipyard where they're recruiting overseas. And the reason they are is because we did not have an NDP government or a Liberal government with enough foresight to make sure we trained people for those jobs here, even on 5 years' notice. That's why we need to get on to a long-term plan.
Mr. McNeil, I want to get back to the film tax credit there. In the last campaign, you said you would continue and expand the film tax credit. Was it a mistake to cut that credit?
Before I answer that, if you don't mind, I'd like to correct the record. The fact of the matter is we've continued to offer young people jobs in the last 3 years. Why? We had the Graduate Opportunities Program. We changed it now where it's going to be, where we'll be looking at master's degrees, provide them an opportunity in this province. We're continuing to make sure broaden an apprenticeship. This doesn't happen prior to this election. This has been building up over a period of time. It's why we're seeing more young people choose to stay in Nova Scotia. You're looking at the activity in and around the investment in the startup community, all driven by young people. That didn't happen overnight. That's taken a period of time for us to build that. When you go to the film industry, I appreciate you asking me the question. We came into government with some very difficult challenges. We had a $500 million deficit staring us in the face. We had an industry that had a 50 to 65% labor subsidy. We had to make a choice. We said we believe this industry is valuable to our province. We want to continue to. So we made a 25% subsidy, but it wasn't just on labor. It was an all-in spend. So whether you were the small business in the community where that shoot was happening, your activity would be part of that 25%. We're seeing that film fund come and be working. We're now seeing activity in the province. The largest film, one of the largest films in our province's history has come in under that program. That's a positive thing. We're seeing people take advantage of that. But equally, and I think one of the things that's also important here, this fund is open and transparent. Unlike the former tax credit, no one knew who was doing what. No one knew who was getting what. This is open and transparent for taxpayers. We're seeing the industry grow. We're seeing it's more flexible. And it's beyond just the film industry. It's actually owed in communities to businesses that are working in and around that sector.
Excuse me, but did the fact that you had given your word not to do that, did that not enter into the decision?
We had, well, as I said to you, Gary, we have a film industry today. We have a film fund in this province. We've made that commitment, and that commitment is fair.
If you hadn't driven a truck over it.
Just imagine what every other industries would happen if I gave them a 25% subsidy.
But he's right. You promised them
what would
to
I do
extend
then?
the tax credit. You should answer his question. It's a good question. Didn't that bother you when you broke that promise? Because we all have seen it on tape that you made that promise.
We've continued to invest in the film industry in this province. We'll continue to invest in it. We're seeing positive signs. Green Nova Scotia actually had their website, which laid out all the reasons why this fund works, why people should come to Nova Scotia, and they've realized the fact that people are recognizing, as you said, I think you might have said, but McDonald said, this is a great place to be growing that industry. We agree. That's why we're going to continue to make that investment that's affordable to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia.
All right, Mr. Burrell, you're advocating deficit spending, quite a lot of it. Is it fair for taxpayers to pay up to 65% of the labor costs to keep film productions here?
I think that the film and television business is ideally suited to the circumstances of Nova Scotia. If we were to write a prototype for what we're looking for, an industry that is full of creative, intelligent, driven, project-based people, full of all kinds of skills, mobile, that can go to all different parts of the province, this would be exactly the place where we would want to place our chips. This is an industry that from every indication, and particularly the indication of the PricewaterhouseCoopers report, which I had hoped when the government saw it would have led them to change their mind, from every indication is exactly worthy of the kind of investment that we ought to have made. I think the government made a mistake in withdrawing it and in failing when they got the report to change their mind.
Mr. Bailey, quickly.
The fact of the matter is the government makes money on the film industry. We make a profit on it, and we use that money to pay for health care and education. The film industry contributes to the economy of Nova Scotia. Mr. McNeil didn't understand that. I mean, I wish he'd actually said, yes, we messed that up. I'm sorry, and we'll fix it. We gave him that chance every day in the legislature when this was all going on because it's that important. But even now, after 2 years, and the industry half its size, that's not going to happen under Mr. McNeil. I think people see if we want to get those jobs back, We are going to need to change the government to get them.
Mr. Mcneil, you said that tourism and fish exports are up in this province, but the overall economy has remained stagnant. What would you do to try and elevate other portions of the economy in this province?
Well, it's driven by innovation. It's why we continue to make those investments. It's why I talked about the startup. It's why, as a government, we purchased the waterfront on the Dartmouth side from the federal government to ensure that we create an ocean cluster where we're building a community not only where there are startups going to be in the center of that, but large industry, bringing researchers out of Dalhousie just to incubate businesses that will be able to spur off and grow. And it's why we have, as part of our platform and budget, we have innovation in agriculture. The Honeycrisp program, which was a phenomenal success. We're now looking for the new variety, which will take it to the next level. The investment we're making in the wine industry to ensure that we're creating good jobs. Those two sectors alone will provide 1,500 opportunities for people in this province. We're going to continue to make those strategic investments, but working alongside sectors and the industry. It is the private sector that will drive this opportunity. We'll work with them to make those strategic investments, to give their businesses a chance to grow and to give young people and all Nova Scotians a chance to work here.
Mr. Mcneil, the GDP growth in this province has remained the slowest in the Maritimes.
I'm very proud of the fact that when we didn't avoid the challenges that are being faced in some provinces. We came in, we put ourselves on a fiscal health that we can now make these investments that allow us to capitalize on the opportunities that are before us. We now have a trade deal with Europe that we'll be able to capitalize on. As a government, we work very hard to build an economy in Asia to make sure that our export opportunities are in there. We announced in part of this budget that we're going to have an accelerator that will actually build companies that want to export to continue to take them to the next level. Those are all positive signs. We've seen what happens when governments tried to fix this in 6 months. It fails each and every time. What we've made is strategic investments that are long-lasting and are changing the economy of this province in a positive way.
Jump in, Mr. Burrow.
Mr. Mcneil, I hate to interrupt this litany of wonders, but I want to just ask you one key question about our economy. Do you acknowledge as a fact that food bank use in Nova Scotia has risen faster in the last year than in any other province in our country?
I would agree with you that food bank use is too high in this province. It's why we've continued to make investments.
Do you acknowledge that as a fact?
Why we continue to make the basic personal exemption increase that'll impact those that are using the food banks. It's why when we look at changing the income rate for income assistance, bringing it to a stable level, and those that are work will increase in 2%, and Nova Scotia with a disability will increase 5%, which would take it to levels it's never been before in our province. We were, as a province, increased the largest increase in income assistance of any government in our history. You and I share these things. We're concerned about them. We may have a different way in how we get to finding the solution, but they're very hard. I agree with you. But I do agree with you, Gary. There are too many people. I agree 100%. There are too many people using food banks. That's why we're trying to find a long-term solution.
I would hope we all agree that there are too many people using food banks. That's obvious. A problem is when Mr. Mcneil talks about innovation, he means you fellas think of something. Well, government should be innovative too, particularly in the areas of economic development. People are very frustrated when they see their tax dollars go to these giant payroll rebates like the one that Mr. Mcneil gave to the Royal Bank of Canada, one of the richest companies in our country, one that when I ran the credit union used to compete against every day without a cent, and yet they got $23 million. I think we've got to get rid of that. That is old-style thinking. That is 1950s-style thinking. It doesn't work. If it worked, we'd all have 3 jobs. We're actually trying to make government innovative by trying new things, like bringing the corporate tax rate down equally and fairly for every company, which costs less money, and making it conditional on them actually hiring Nova Scotians. It's time for government to try some innovation as well. That's the kind of long-term thinking we need if we're ever going to turn this situation around.
All right, Mr. Mcneil, in March, your government announced the biggest payroll rebate program in the province's history. That's expanding IBM, giving them another $10 million. This is a massive company. Why should Nova Scotians help it out?
So we're competing with every jurisdiction across the world when it comes to these companies. When you look at the payroll rebate, it's a net positive for the province. We're bringing people in. We're in no way, and before they ever get any rebate in the province, they have to hire a Nova Scotian at the wage they commit to. They have to be employed for an entire year. All their taxes have to be paid. Those companies have continued to grow inside of our province. What we're finding as well, from those large companies being here, we're getting spin-offs, quite frankly. They're innovative, young, hardworking Nova Nova Scotians are finding new ways, find technology to be part of that. And those companies are making other investments in our province to continue for us to build the economy of Nova Scotia. But I think it's important to recognize that the payroll rebate that you would see that goes out to one of these companies, the job is here for a year. The rebate doesn't get paid until all taxes are paid, and what is rebated back is less than what we receive in taxes, unlike when we came into power under the Conservative and NDP government, where they would write a blank check. No job commitments, no job targets. They would just write them funding. We have said there has to be a job committed to that funding, and it needs to be here, and all taxes need to be paid.
Mr. Burrell, what's wrong with that? No money goes out until the job is created.
Our party and our platform has dedicated ourselves to the view that we need to focus more on local businesses, on medium-sized and smaller enterprises, and that this needs to be the place where our economic development incentives need to be focused. That's my opinion.
Okay, Mr. Bailey, very quickly.
Thank you.
If other provinces do it, Nova Scotia doesn't. You know, are the jobs going to go elsewhere?
Look, apparently Mr. Mcneil wants to defend the multi-million-dollar rebates because the government makes money, and yet he doesn't think the film tax credit's worth saving, even though it does make money. There's no strategy in that. There's no vision.
A 9% subsidy and a 50% subsidy.
We do have to compete.
A 9% subsidy,
we do have to compete with the rest of the world. I think it's very sad that we're the worst in the Maritimes. This is Nova Scotia. We should be the best in the Maritimes. But I'd rather be the premier that competes because we have great health care, and we have great schools, and we have the lowest tax rate in the country for job creators. That is the new way to compete instead of these handouts, which I'm actually surprised Mr. Mcneil is defending since he campaigned against them last time.
Mr. Mcneil, very quickly.
Thank you very much. We also are actually increasing the small business threshold from $350 to $500, leaving more money in the pockets of entrepreneurs in this province. And we've also been recognized by the Canadian Federation of Independents as the jurisdiction in Canada to lead the way reducing red tape. We're going to continue to go down that road so the people who actually generate the jobs, the small businesses across this province, will have access to the capital they earn, at the same time do it in a jurisdiction without the restrictions that were left behind by the New Democrats and the PCs.
Okay, we're now to the section of the debate where the questions are coming from the viewers. The first one we have is actually from multiple viewers who have written in to ask how the province will address regulation of recreational marijuana has not been addressed in any of your platforms, yet there is little more than a year to get a policy in place. How specifically do you plan to approach regulation in such a limited time frame? Mr. Burrell, maybe we'll begin with you.
Well, the position of our party is that, to begin with, we think we have a lot of the skills that are needed to conduct this regulation in the right way in the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission. So we are looking to the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission to be the agency that would conduct this regulation. We also think that we've got some time here. We've got over a year until this needs to be worked out, and there is ample opportunity for us to have a full consultation. So we have committed ourselves to have that consultation if we form the government. My own view is that it would not be sensible to have a marijuana access age that was lower than our legal drinking age, but within that general parameter and the parameter of the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission being the regulatory agency, we're prepared to have that consultation and work that out.
Mr. Bailey, what are your thoughts?
Well, you're quite right. This is being imposed on us by Ottawa on a very short timeline. And I think that's too bad because this is a very important topic. For me, rule number one, we have to protect our kids. 18 is way too low. We do need to talk to our scientists, to our mental health workers, to people who are experts in this area, and make sure we pick an age that keeps our young minds safe. And I'll tell you, I don't know what that is. But that's not the job of a leader to stand on this stage and dictate these things. We do have to go work with people that know so we can set the right age. As for where it's retailed, right now, I don't know. I'm wide open-minded on how we do it as long as we don't inadvertently create a black market and that we keep young minds safe. Beyond that, there's a whole lot of work to do, and I acknowledge that we're under a short leash to get that done. That is a shame because this is a major change in the health and safety, particularly of young Nova Scotians, and it is being driven by Ottawa, and we are not being given the right amount of time to make sure that we put the right protections in place.
Mr. Mcneil, did you want in on that?
Yeah, thank you. This has been an issue that the Justice Minister and the Attorney General has been working with her counterparts across the country. I've brought this issue up with my Atlantic colleagues. So we're looking at making sure that in Atlantic Canada we have a uniformed approach to how we deal with this issue. I do believe the age is one of the issues that we would deal with. I agree with Gary. 19 seems to be the logical critical age, but we're prepared to listen and talk to people when you talk about we provide alcohol at that age now. I think one of the things that was missed when the national government made their commitment to what happens to edibles, that was never part of the conversation, which I believe will be a big part of this. I'm also concerned about, because I think the consumption will be, that people will want this product. We need to make sure that is just not a large corporation that potentially is going to provide that substance. We now have cases where Nova Scotians are providing that product from a medical permit. Can we expand those a bit? How do we make sure, create niche businesses, just like we've done the craft brewery, to make sure that the product that is going out is safe, but at the same time that the activity is happening here in the province, but it has to be done in a thoughtful way. And I do believe we can get this accomplished by July 1st, and I'm looking forward to, if the Nova Scotians give me the privilege, to continuing to work with my Atlantic colleagues to make sure that we deal with the issue as a region, because the last thing we want is to end up with people at the borders changing and all of those kinds of things. This is, in many ways, we're dealing with a substance with a blank slate. Let's get it right.
All right, we're moving on to another viewer question. Doug Cochran in Halifax asks, something we haven't heard a lot about is the environment. I'd like to know what each candidate proposes with regard to protecting Nova Scotia resources. What are their positions on fracking, the Bay of Fundy, wind power projects, etc.? Start with you, Mr. Burrell.
Well, we are in favor of continuing the present fracking moratorium period. But a number of these considerations point to a very important element of our platform, which is an environmental Bill of Rights. There are other parts of Canada that have an environmental Bill of Rights. The East Coast Environmental Law has recently called for us to have it in Nova Scotia. We propose that if we become the government, we will make an environmental Bill of Rights enshrining the right to clean air and clean water for every person in Nova Scotia, and the right of all citizens of Nova Scotia to be consulted about anything affecting the environment around them, and establishing a position of an independent environment commissioner, which is analogous to the position of our Auditor General, someone who reports directly on behalf of citizens to the legislature.
Your thoughts, Mr. Bailey?
Look, protecting the environment, in my opinion, is one of the most progressive, conservative things that we do. I think all Nova Scotians are proud that we lead the country in these areas because of the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, which was groundbreaking in ensuring that we protected the environment while we moved ahead with our economy. I want to extend that for another 30 years and up those targets to 2017 standards. People, I think, also need to know that as part of our plan to kickstart the economy, we are finding the resources to clean up some of our most toxic environmental sites, like Boat Harbour, like others that are a scar on the pristine state of the province as we would like to have it. As for fracking, well, I've been on this for a while. I do believe communities should have that choice. Mr. Mcneil decided to ban it. I oppose that ban. I want to put strong environmental regulations in place and then go community by community and let them choose if they want to pursue the jobs and the environmental safety that they can have with it or not. And if they don't, that's fine.
Mr. Mcneil.
Thanks very much. I'm very proud of our record, very proud of dealing with Pictou Landing when it came to Boat Harbour. We're well on our way to ensuring that the legacy of Boat Harbour gets cleaned up so that community can continue to go back into the pristine environment that it was settled around. We have continued committed to a moratorium on fracking. We've also, as a province, it wasn't just our party, all three parties played a role in this. We lead the country in GHG reductions. I'm proud of the fact that we were able to negotiate a cap and trade system that won't impact the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians in this province. That's a positive thing. The other part of this, I think we need to begin to work with our municipalities to ensure that in low-lying areas across the province where building permits are being allowed to happen, that we need to do a coastal strategy to make sure that we're protecting the coast at the same time making sure that development can happen. We need to make sure it's happening in an environmental way and that we're protecting those pristine parts of our province. And on one final note, we've committed to bringing in independent analysis of the way we've been harvesting off Crown land. I live in southwestern Nova Scotia. I've heard from a lot of private woodlot owners who are saying to me they can't put their wood into the marketplace. At the same time, I'm hearing from some of my constituents who are saying there's a tremendous amount of activity on Crown land. We need to strike that balance. We'll come out and there will be no long-term leases on Crown land until we get that report.
We've heard your position on clear cutting. The next question is actually on that from the audience, so maybe I'll ask the other two leaders. Almost 90% of the forestry harvesting on Nova Scotia Crown land uses clear cutting. Multiple people have contacted us to ask what is your party's position on the level of clear cutting in Nova Scotia and how might it change if you form government? Mr. Bailey.
Yeah, we got to get it down. That is not right. I can tell you in my own constituency, we have the beautiful Wentworth Valley, where there's been too much clear cutting. And it's actually affecting everything from wind patterns to snow removal to runoff going into some of our best lakes. We need to stop that. At the same time, it's not just limited to Wentworth. We have to do a complete review of Crown land management and complete review of the Western lands, as Mr. Mcneil just mentioned, as well as the other private and Crown head lands, to see what is the best way to get jobs out of our forests without these kinds of problems. I don't think the answer is to ban it. The answer is certainly not to encourage it. We literally need to have a long-term plan that looks at forest stands, both private and Crown, to make sure that they're being harvested in the most sustainable way.
Mr. Burrell.
27 years ago, I came to be the minister in the community of Upper Musquodoboit, which is one of the most woods business-related communities in the province. And I became as someone that didn't understand a great deal about the woods economy. And so I asked everyone I met for years, who worked in the mill, who worked in the woods, contractors, mill, everyone, in your view, is the present harvest level in the woods sustainable? And in 25 years, I only ever heard anyone say, yes, it's sustainable, who was paid by someone else to say so. So I was very proud when, in our government, we implemented the limit of 50% on the amount of land that can be cut by clear cutting. This was a limit that was came to by one of the most democratic grassroots processes that the province has seen, the natural resource strategy. In my judgment, the abandonment of the clear cut limit and the abandonment of the ban on whole tree harvesting out of the natural resource strategy is one of the singular failures of the Mcneil Liberal administration.
Before you pass on that, I wouldn't mind making a comment. One of your former colleagues, as we're talking about this conversation, Sid Press, who would be here talking, I'm sure, to all of us about the fact that we need to value our forestry. It's one of the few places where we don't actually value the commodity tree by tree and get the maximum value, whether it's pine or oak. We treat it all the same. I think he was onto something, and I think we need to continue down that road. Is how do we maximize the best value of the product and the fiber that we had, at the same time ensuring that we're protecting enough for Nova Scotians.
All right, well, Mary Lou Robertson writes to ask, our family pharmacare program is the main safety net program for drug coverage for younger adults. Its efficacy has never been evaluated since it was rolled out in 2008. It continues to have the highest out-of-pocket cost to patients in the country. What do you plan to do to improve pharmacare for younger adults in Nova Scotia? Mr. Bailey, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, we need to make sure the premiums are affordable. We need to elect a government that will never again try and jack up the seniors' pharmacare by 100 or 200%, as Mr. Mcneil tried to do. I know he backed off and apologized for doing it, and I commend him for that. But the fact of the matter is, his government was prepared to watch 15,000 seniors drop out of pharmacare because they couldn't afford it. I would never do that. That is so cruel. We can never have that. Same with family pharmacare. It has to be affordable. While we're doing that, we also have to make sure that we look after people in need. Just 2 days ago, we announced that we were going to add oral cancer medications to the list of things covered for people that are in pharmacare or are not in private insurance, because there's a great unfairness in our system. We're all very proud of the fact we're Canadians and that we have this universal health care system. But when you get cancer, as 6,000 Nova Scotians a year do, you have to be in the hospital to get the IV or chemo coverage that you need. But we have modern drugs, like oral cancer drugs, that can help you heal from home, but we don't cover those. We don't cover those, and people actually risk bankruptcy trying to heal themselves. So yes, cost is absolutely important. We've got to hold it down, but we also have to make sure that we're covering people when they really need it.
All right, Mr. Burrell.
We have committed in our platform to freeze premiums in the seniors pharmacare program, and we introduced legislation a couple of years ago to make certain that in future any increases in the premium structure of pharmacare of the sort that were floated a year ago by the Liberal government, in future this would never be able to take place without the proposal being brought to the floor of the House and being voted on by the representatives of the people. But I do think the core issue here is our need for a national pharmacare program.
All right, Mr. Mcneil.
Well, working with our Atlantic partners right now to figure out how do we make sure, looking at our formularities, our goal is across the region for buying purchases, but also making sure that our formularies are the same to hopefully with the goal of, as Gary said, to lead a move across the country for a national farmer care program. I think all of us would agree that no family should be put in the position that many families are around when it comes to oral cancer drugs. We've been working with our colleagues. One of the things that we've seen in some of our sister provinces across the country is that when governments have taken over the oral cancer drugs, the private insurers have stepped back, causing the cost of it to be very differently. We've seen in some provinces where they began to restrict their formulary in a way that not all of the drugs are being covered. We want to make sure that as we roll out something, and my hope is that we'll be able to do it in Atlantic Canada, that we ensure that the private insurers are still there, at the same time making sure that the formulary doesn't get shrunk, because it is important. All of us have heard from families who have been put in dire financial strait because they're dealing with drugs, as Mr. Bailey would say, as Jamie would say, that were covered in a hospital but are not covered at home. And all of us, I believe, all Nova Scotians believe that's unacceptable. And that will be the goal of our government, to have that in place by the end of this year.
One final quick question from Logan Henderson from Halifax, who asks, youth can't vote, so they don't have their voices heard as much as other people who can vote. What will you do to make sure that people under 18 have their voices heard in politics? Mr. Bailey.
Well, first of all, I never miss a chance to go into a school, and I'm pretty sure my leader colleagues will say the same thing, rightly, to talk about our system of government. I know it looks messy sometimes, but a lot of men and women went overseas to defend it. Many of them didn't come home. People are wondering, when they see all the promises going around, as I know they are, does it matter? Why should I bother? Whether you're young or old, I would just remind you all that despite all its warts, democracy is the best system, and I think our young people need to know that. And I guess I'll finish with this. I do believe we have to put civics back in our classrooms so they learn how our system works.
All right, we're going to have to end on that note. That's all the time we have for questions, and our debate ends with closing statements from each leader. The order was drawn by lots, and the first is Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. I know you're wondering who to trust to finally move us forward. After the last 8 years, I can understand why. The NDP promised not to raise our taxes. Then the HST went up and our power bill soared. Mr. Mcneil promised a lot of things, from family doctors to education to the film industry. He broke all those promises. As president of the credit union, I was accountable to my members every day. I answered to them, and we grew that company together. I am prepared to answer to you for our plan, with strong accountability measures in place for you to judge how we do. I will be a premier who listens to you and works with teachers and doctors and nurses instead of against them. I ask that you look at the backgrounds of the three of us on this stage. Look at our records and our platforms, and then make your best choice. Together, I know we can build a more prosperous Nova Scotia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Now it's over to the leader of the Liberal Party, Mr. Steve Mcneil.
Thank you, Tom. I love this province and its people, and I'm proud of what we've achieved together. Let's not turn back now. The NDP believe we should run a $1 billion deficit. The Conservatives believe they don't need to account for their promises. I believe we are in a time where we can make strategic investments and continue to build on what we've accomplished. A Nova Scotia that has lowered the youth unemployment rate, a Nova Scotia that is retaining more youth, and a Nova Scotia whose population is at an all-time high. Our plan is progressive, thoughtful, and fact-based. Our plan creates more jobs for young Nova Scotians and more opportunities for the middle class. Our plan helps families save money by funding pre-primary, helping those who are caring for an aging loved one. It invests in roads, in hospitals, and schools. It cuts income tax for 500,000 Nova Scotians. It reduces small business tax and cuts red tape to create jobs in Nova Scotia. We are supporting our agriculture and fisheries sectors so they can grow and hire. We've worked together to make our province stronger. We can't stop now. Our platform builds on your hard work and your success. Let's continue the momentum. I ask for your support. Let's keep building on a stronger Nova Scotia together.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mcneil. Our final speaker tonight is Gary Burrell.
When I was a kid, my grandfather in Yarmouth used to like to marvel with me at how much better everything had become for everyone in his lifetime. Pensions and the baby bonus and Medicare. And he would often then say, imagine how much easier it'll all be for everybody by the time you get my age, which I more or less am now. And grandparents don't talk this way to their grandchildren anymore. We find ourselves in a place where the idea that things are going to be better in the future has been lost and compromised and squashed. And by what? By the mistaken belief that our hands are tied, that we can't, through our government, get to the place we need to go. But our hands aren't tied. We actually can have a Nova Scotia where the health care everybody needs is available where and when they need it. We actually can have a Nova Scotia where everybody's job pays them enough to live. We actually can have a Nova Scotia where nobody is forced to food banks. To get there, we need to look beyond the one-year budget cycle and move with confidence and hope towards the longer-term investments that can get us where we need to go. Together, we can really do this. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Mr. Burrell. And that brings us to the end of our election debate.
Thank you to the three leaders, to our studio audience, and to you at home. If you want to watch it again, you can find it on our webpage, our Facebook page, and on the CBC Nova Scotia YouTube channel.
And now it's over to you to make your decision. We hope that what you heard tonight will help you make up your mind. And remember, whichever party you support, is of no use unless you vote.
There are lots of ways to do that between now and Election Day on May 30th. You can cast a vote at any returning office from now until Election Day, except on Sundays. There will be advance polls open during the week before Election Day.
In fact, Elections Nova Scotia lists a dozen different ways to vote, so make sure you take advantage of one of them. You can get all the details of how, when, and where to cast your ballot on our website at cbc.ca/ns.
And on election night, CBC News will have all the results as soon as they come in. The polls close at 8 p.m. on May the 30th, and that is when our results coverage begins. You can watch us here on CBC Television, listen on CBC Radio, or get up to the second results online at cbc.ca/ns and our Facebook page.
And of course, to keep on top of what's happening in the campaign, stay with CBC News. Our team of political journalists is covering every twist, turn, and announcement of this election on radio, television, and online.
Thank you so much for watching tonight's debate. We'll be back tomorrow night at 6 with CBC Nova Scotia News.